gave the defenders a better platform for firing their cannons against a besieging force. Even if Cromwell's men somehow survived the artillery fire and made it through the outer walls of the fort, they still had to contend with a deep, dry moat, which would surely turn into a graveyard for them. Further complicating Cromwell's plans, there was no safe port near Duncannon to land and unload his heavy siege cannons. That left him with only his small field guns for the siege.
Ready! And fire!
Cromwell's small guns were no match for the angled walls of Duncannon. True to its design, the fort could not be penetrated.
At that point, Cromwell's tactical ineptness as a siege commander starts to come into play. This tactical bullishness is, when met with resistance, not the only way forward, and he can't think of another solution. That's all he's got in his locker, as it were.
Unable to make any progress, a frustrated Cromwell was forced to call off the siege of Duncannon. Cromwell's prospects of taking Waterford were now in question. The mark of a great general is his ability to innovate, adapt, and overcome. If Oliver Cromwell still hoped to conquer Ireland, he'd have to do just that. In November of 1649, Oliver Cromwell was very much a man in trouble. He'd come to Ireland in search of one large, decisive battle. The enemy wouldn't give it to him. What was supposed to be a quick, conquering campaign was dragging on. Through attrition, his 12,000-man field army had been reduced to only 3,000.
He's losing men, not necessarily from combat, but from disease. Ireland is a place in the 17th century that punishes large armies, and small armies can't survive. Dysentery, other diseases sweep through the ranks very early on in the campaign.
Frustrated by his failed effort to capture the fort at Duncannon, Cromwell's plan to seize Waterford by sea had to be completely retooled. Instead of moving troops and supplies up the river from the south, he would have to bring them overland from the north. Only one enemy could stop Cromwell's advance now, and that was the Irish weather. Heavy rains came, which made moving troops difficult and rolling in heavy siege guns nearly impossible. By 2 December 1649, Cromwell realized that a siege of Waterford under these conditions would be unwise.
With that, Cromwell withdrew his forces and gave up his campaign to attack and take Waterford.
The new model army retired to winter quarters in garrisons stretching throughout the southwest of Ireland, where Cromwell had been employing politics rather than ballistics to convince a series of towns to surrender. At the same time, members of Parliament were writing to Cromwell with increasingly desperate pleas. The son of King Charles had gone to Scotland, where he planned a renewed offensive to restore the monarchy. With the new British government in danger, Cromwell was asked to come home and save the day.
The pressure on him to go back to England to start to resolve the conflict which is blowing up between England and Scotland is intense at this point.
With this new sense of urgency and a break in the Irish weather, Cromwell delayed his return to England in order to put his war machine back on the march at the end of January. Waterford had proved too difficult to capture, so Cromwell set his sights on Kilkenny, the seat of power for General Ormond and the center of the Irish resistance. Now, Cromwell began the most complicated maneuvering of his Irish campaign. He split his forces into two main columns, forming a huge pincer. With that, Cromwell crushed all resistance in his path and converged around Kilkenny in late March. Victory at Kilkenny would require seizing both the town and Kilkenny Castle, which had the added significance of being General Ormond's home. The castle stood on high ground overlooking the River Nore. A wall connected to the castle spread out to surround the adjacent town. Cromwell's first move was to send a detachment of redcoats to set up a cannon battery outside the south wall. They opened a breach.
Charge!
Cromwell then ordered his infantry to assault. And Cromwell kept up the pressure for several days, sending more infantry assaults into town and blasting a second breach into the walls. On 27 March, the governor of Kilkenny finally surrendered, both the town and the castle. While the surrender of Kilkenny was an important victory for Cromwell, the Irish were not yet conquered. A fierce pocket of resistance existed in the nearby town of Clonmel. For his final battle in Ireland, he would attack them. In late April 1650, Oliver Cromwell's rejuvenated army of 8,000 soldiers and 600 cavalry arrived at the walls of Clonmel on the banks of the River Suir. The name Clonmel, it seemed, would now be added to the bloody toll begun at Drogheda 7 months before.
Touch them where they stand!
But the citizens of Clonmel had reason to take heart. In command of their garrison was Hugh Duff O'Neill, an experienced warrior and resistance leader. He had 2,000 men under his command, mostly Irish Catholic troops from Ulster.
The most disciplined, the most successful, the most experienced troops that the Irish had were these Ulster Irish forces. Hugh Duff was one of the few commanders that seems to be able to take on Cromwell and seems to be confident in taking him on.
Cromwell had little choice about where to place his heavy guns, the biggest of which weighed 8,000 pounds. With a river to the south and marshy terrain to the east and west, the only ground that could support these monsters was to the north. Because of this, Cromwell wouldn't be able to use his favorite tactic of creating two simultaneous breaches. This didn't worry Cromwell, although it should have, since it meant that O'Neill could focus his defense on one killing zone instead of two. It took nearly a day for Cromwell's guns to breach the walls. The plan was to send the infantry in first. Once they were in, they'd swing around and open one of the town's gates for the waiting cavalry. Cromwell ordered the charge and personally joined his cavalry at the gate. He had no idea that O'Neill had prepared a nasty surprise. In the spring of 1650, Oliver Cromwell's redcoats began their defiant charge into the town of Clonmel, the latest target on their campaign to conquer Ireland. Intoning hymns and psalms as they charged, they poured through the breach, God's army storming its way to yet another victory. But the Irish commander of the garrison, Hugh O'Neill, had other ideas. He had laid a trap. Behind the city walls, he'd constructed two walls perpendicular to the breach and one parallel to it, forming a pen. Atop the walls, O'Neill placed his artillery and men. Once Cromwell's men charged through the killing zone, the Irish were able to fire down on them like shooting fish in a barrel.
The guys following into the breach didn't know that their colleagues were trapped inside the wall, so they kept on pouring in, pouring in, pouring in.
O'Neill had built the walls of his trap with firing steps, allowing musketeers to fire, then duck down and reload while another man stepped up to discharge his shot. Other musketeers fired down from the windows of surrounding houses. Death came in many ways to Cromwell's soldiers who were caught in O'Neill's trap. Some were stabbed with pikes or slashed with scythes. Others were crushed by timber blocks hurled by an improvised catapult. Still others were mutilated by cannons firing chain shot. This is what's known as chain shot. It's essentially two cannonballs joined by a length of chain. When this was fired, it would spin through the air and cut a bloody path through an enemy formation. Even if the chain broke, which it often did under the impact of firing, it simply turned the cannon into the ultimate shotgun. It may be that war is hell is the ultimate cliche, but the fighting in the breach at Clonmel sure came close. When the town gates didn't open quickly, Cromwell sensed that something was going wrong with the assault. He rode over to the breach to see for himself and was furious to see his men retreating from the wall. Cromwell urged his infantry to fight on, but for the first time, his charisma had no effect on his troops. So he ordered his cavalry to dismount and sent them into the breach.
Cross swords, charge! Yeah!
He really just has one tactic, which is to blast the walls and charge in. Now that works successfully at Drogheda and to some degree at Wexford as well. At Clonmel it goes disastrously wrong, and Cromwell really doesn't have a plan B.
Fighting continued inside the walls for 3 hours before Cromwell was forced to admit defeat and call off his assault.
Fall back!
Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,500 parliamentary soldiers died in that assault, around a tenth of Cromwell's army. Many of his senior officers lay dead.
The resistance put up by Hugh O'Neill was very effective and cost Cromwell a great many men and really gave him a bloody nose. I mean, even great generals had bad days at the office. Cromwell was no exception. He didn't bat 1,000, and nobody does.
Surprisingly, the following day, the mayor of Clonmel surrendered the town to Cromwell. But when Cromwell marched through the gates, he discovered that Duff O'Neill had outwitted him again. Low on ammunition and supplies, the cunning Irish commander had moved his force out of town under cover of darkness. In the end, Cromwell had succeeded in taking the town, but the siege of Clonmel remains a blight on his record. After Clonmel, Cromwell finally gave in to the mounting pressure to return to England. He departed Ireland on 26 May 1650 to prepare for war against a royalist invasion force in Scotland. He left the Irish campaign in the hands of his son-in-law, Henry Ireton. Under Ireton's command, the Redcoats were finally able to take the town of Waterford. It took more than 2 years, but town by town, Oliver Cromwell's new model army eventually conquered the entire Emerald Isle. Military victory didn't spell the end of Cromwell's intervention in Ireland. After the war ended, he set in motion what became known as the Cromwellian Settlement. It was a plan that saw the land of 3,000 Catholics seized and turned over to English Protestants.
This left a legacy of bitterness for hundreds of years. That bitterness and dispossession has made it impossible to establish good relations between Ireland and England, and that legacy is with us, at least to a degree, to this day.
After conquering the Irish and defeating the Scots, Cromwell put away his sword and went back to politics. In 1653, he dissolved Parliament and took personal control of Britain as its Lord Protector. After his death in 1658, the monarchy was quickly restored, and public sentiment turned so against Cromwell that his body was exhumed, hanged for public display, and then beheaded. To the Irish, that must have seemed like ultimate justice. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Thanks for watching Conquerors.